Welcome to Deep Dive into the Archive. Today, we're diving into the album Carboniferous by Zoo. So, Zoo are an
Italian avant-garde jazz band?
Avant-garde, noise rock, jazz, metal
Industrial
band. There's a lot of genres that Zoo is. I remember when we first found this, we were literally, one of us was like, hey, what's a weird genre combination that no one would think of? One of us said, like, noise jazz. And then we looked up noise jazz and we found this album.
And it is an interesting album.
It is really interesting. It's certainly one of the most unique just albums of the 2000s, I feel. The way that they combine these various genres is really interesting. You have, I think in total the band has a saxophone player, a guitarist, a bassist, and a drummer. And they play these like really noisy, cacophonous sounding songs, but you also have this like wild card of the saxophone in the mix that just goes insane. It works so well with the super noisy sound that the band creates.
Yeah, I want to mention their guitarist, Stefano Piglia, is not on this album. There are a couple tracks which feature guest artists. At the time, the band was just a trio of baritone saxophone, drums, and electric bass. Given that setup and just the overwhelming noise that they're able to create, it is truly impressive, I'd say. From there, we can easily hop right into the first track, Ostia. Hearing this track for the first time is definitely eye-opening, I'd say, because it just starts out and just this pummeling noise coming at you, and there's squealing saxophone going all throughout, and it sounds really cool.
The saxophone feels like so like squeaky almost. I don't like using the term, but like very noodly with how it's played. It complements the very oppressive feel that like the bass and drums create on the track. I think for most of their songs, they always feel like they're constantly evolving and changing and moving forward with the composition. There's never really a point where it stays still. Like it feels like it's constantly building to something or changing its sound in some way, which I think works really well for the album.
Yeah, and a lot of these tracks, they come right out the gate with a lot of high energy, and the fact that they're able to still move and be kinetic from that point, it's really entertaining, I'd say, throughout the entire album.
I also want to mention Ostia is the name of the town or city they're from.
Yeah, it's where the band formed. It's the name of the town. Also, we're not Italian, so we're going to pronounce Italian names wrong. Like Ostia is an Italian name, so I want to say the next track, Chthonian, there's this oppressive noise on the track, and then the guitar just cuts through the noise really well. The guitar on this track is done by King Buzzo of the Melvins. Cool feature there. But the way that they were able to present the noise on one side and the guitar on the other, it's very cool sonically.
Especially with how the saxophone, again, plays into that, and how it's kind of present throughout, and then at the end it just comes in totally, like, unleashed, I guess. Just totally unhinged. It's really fantastic and wild. I also want to mention the variety of guest artists on this album is really impressive, because, as you said, we have Buzzo from the Melvins on this track, and also later on the album, Mike Patton does guest vocals.
Yeah, he's guest vocals on Soul Olympics, and he also is credited with a guest appearance on the closer Orc.
I think he might have also helped with production or something.
This album does come out on Mike Patton's label, Ipecac.
Definitely, I think, does help give variety to the album, and certainly appreciated when these guest appearances come up.
Not to say that the band doesn't have a whole host of ideas on their own, but variety is always good.
The next track, Carbon. The saxophone on this track has this like super like dense, thick sound to it that complements the guitars and bass incredibly well. I feel like on this track, it is honestly like heavier sounding than the actual bass, which I think is really impressive. And especially the way they're able to like build atmosphere throughout this album, I think is really great. There's a lot of tracks where they kind of make these compositions that feel like they're kind of plodding along and building up almost tension in a way. And I think with how they combined everything with the saxophone, it creates just such an overpowering presence in the music.
Yeah, if there's like one word I had to use to describe the feel of this album, it would be oppressive, with how noisy and cacophonous everything is. The way the band is able to build up the sonics, I think it is actually probably the best track, in my opinion. This is the next track, Beata Viscera. It starts out with this very rolling kinetic start, and then it has this harsh noise sitting in the background that just throughout the track just keeps building and exploding, and then building and exploding, this release of like kinetic energy, which I think is really great. Makes it it's a really interesting track to listen to. Very kinetic.
This track has like almost a booming sound to it. Everything is very like loud and like almost in your face with how just overpowering it is. I also love how this track transitions into the next one, Aranese.
I don't know. I don't get the. I don't know if it's something in Italian. I don't understand the title of this track either. But yeah, Aranese. I don't know.
Yeah, the way that it transitions into Aranese is very nice. There's just like this like insane like fast paced energy on this track. It has like this sense of like power to it that I think is really great. And the saxophone on this track also just sounds like straight up demonic with how insane it is.
Yeah, especially I do want to give a shout out to their saxophone player, Luca T. Mai. His performance throughout this entire album is just fantastic. The way they're able to use the saxophone to create their sound and to bring a lot of jazziness, as we were saying, to these tracks it's very unique, and definitely I think one of the reasons to check out this album if you're at all interested by what we're saying here.
Then we get Soul Olympics, which is the track that features Mike Patton's vocals, which I think work very well, although I do think Mike Patton sometimes, there's like points where he goes too out there or crazy.
He's kind of a bit edgy, I'd say, at points. Like it's a bit too much at times, and it kind of clashes with like the band's vibe, but I think overall it's at least a nice change of pace to get some vocals and to bring in Mike Patton.
Or when at his best, I think Mike Patton works really well with the instrumentals, but also when he goes over the top, it does kind of take you out of the track. I just want to mention also they use like a couple of effects on his vocals that I also think work out pretty well. I think that it allows his vocals to kind of mesh with everything much better than when it's just kind of his vocals on their own. The next track, Axion, throughout the track there's like this rumbling and uneasiness to it that I think works really well.
Yeah, Axion, definitely one of the quieter tracks on the album, I'd say.
Yeah, throughout it there's these like saxophone interludes that I also think work well. They're kind of like instrumental breaks, I guess. And I think those aspects also add a lot to this uneasiness that's built.
I have some slight problems with this track. I think there's a lot of really good ideas on this track, but they're perhaps a bit too drawn out and they don't mesh super well.
I will agree with you there that I do think there are, on this track and sometimes some other tracks, there are times where the composition is kind of drawn out too long. And it's probably my biggest problem with the album is they sometimes draw out compositions too long and don't spice it up enough. But I do think consistently those compositions are still entertaining.
Another problem I have at some points on this album is that the tracks end a bit quickly. This is actually a problem I have with the next track, Mimosa Hostilis, where I really like the track throughout and then just kind of ends a bit abruptly, I find. It's still a very good track. It has these bass stabs that really bring up and serve to help build the noise on the track, which I think are really interesting.
There's also like the saxophone on that track is just really in your face at points.
It's just going off. The sax goes hard on that track.
And then the next track, Obsidian, has this like really great, like very unsettling sound to it. It kind of just bursts into these super loud, cacophonous arrangements. that are really fantastic. I also love when the track kind of breaks out into this like almost black metal inspired part. There's like a very black metal inspired riff at one point, and the overall feel like almost turns into a black metal album basically. And it works really well, I think, with how it still kind of stays in this noisy style, but takes a lot of elements from black metal.
There are times where it kind of feels like a movie, this track. I don't know, it's weird to explain, but just like gives me that vibe. I especially like the drums on Obsidian, the like marching, beating, like sort of almost tribal drums. The way that they march along on that track, I think is really interesting.
And then finally, we have the last track, Orc. This also had Mike Patton on it, right?
Yes.
And the guitar.
He's no vocals. He is, I assume, playing either guitar or bass.
Yeah. And this definitely has a very, like, really cool atmospheric end, I think, to the album. Especially with how oppressive this track gets in its sound. I think it works very well as a closer.
It's a neat way to wrap up the album. And it's sort of, while still being oppressive, it's not as in your face.
Carboniferous by Zoo, I think this album is firstly very overlooked. I think this album deserves way more attention than it has. And it's just an incredibly interesting combination of like noise rock and jazz and no wave and all sorts of other genres. And I think that they combine it into an album that is incredibly compelling and interesting and something that I don't think I've ever heard anything like. I'd highly recommend this album. Overall, I think this album's like a 9 out of 10 for me. I think the only thing is that, outside of some of Mike Patton's vocals, is that occasionally these compositions are kind of strung out too long and aren't given enough development, but I think that's a somewhat minor complaint for this album of what is like one of the most original sounds I've heard in a metal album in a long time.
I can only agree with what you've been saying. This album, there is such creativity and originality presented. Its sound is like nothing I've heard elsewhere. And I've heard a lot of very noisy albums, a lot of very experimental albums, but the way that they are able to combine genres like jazz and metal and math rock and all these different things is very original, very creative, very compelling as well. You know, I have a few small issues with a track here or a track there, but for the most part, this album is just track after track of incredible music. It is very loud, so if you're not into loudness, probably not your thing. Although, for me, definitely a big fan. I'm at an 8.5 out of 10 on this album. Very good. Would recommend.
Alright, hey, thanks for watching this episode of Deep Dive into the Archive. If you enjoyed it, consider giving it a like. Also consider subscribing to our channel. We got other episodes of Deep Dive into the Archive, or you can check out our album swap series. And yeah, have a good day.